Now, the second part of our talk is the English Catholic heritage. And what was it? Well, first and foremost, it's very difficult for us to look back at the Middle Ages with any understanding. The reason why that is because so much of what medieval society was based on, our society was in a sense conceived in rebellion against. It's like trying to explain capitalism in 1980s Moscow. But without wanting to overly convey into too beautiful a picture, it's important to bear in mind that in medieval England, in Catholic England, the faith really was at the center of things. Even the way they swore. You know how all our swear words have to do with, shall we say, biological functions. Was that prissy enough? Well, I'm just curious. But in those days, they swore differently. God's blood, God's body, by the powers, meaning the order of angels. Interestingly enough, not unlike our own French-Canadian swear words when I was a kid. Isti, which is host. Calice, which is chalice. Yeah, we actually swore that way. Interesting. Anyway, the people swear by what they find important. So, the Middle Ages, if you read your Chaucer, if you read any of the literature of that period, the Middle Ages in England were not a perfect time by any stretch, but they were a very Catholic time, and it influenced every aspect of life in a way that is very difficult for us to understand now. We would consider them in some ways rather savage, but it's important to remember, and this is something that all three of our authors would remind us of in their books. They may look savage to us, but we look pretty bad to them. And if that was true in the 30s and 40s, you can imagine what they would think of our infanticide today, to say nothing of our dealing with marriage, starting with divorce. So it's important to bear this in mind, ladies and gentlemen. When you look at the past, bear in mind that if they could look back at you, we might not look as wonderful as we imagine ourselves to be. All right. Church and state were allied. The church acted, or attempted to, as both the conscience of the king and the nobility, and as the central focus of every community. I suppose sort of the way sports do for us today, or TV, or whatever it is we have as a central principle. I don't know. That was Catholic England. Along comes the Reformation, that all comes to an end. But it doesn't come to an end at once. It's a gradual process. And there is, as you might say, a bifurcation in Catholicity. That's a good word for you, bifurcation. Those who refused to join the new church were called recusants because they refused to take the oaths to the king. Now, I'm sure most of the people here have heard of St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher and all those guys. But have you ever asked yourself, what was it like being a Catholic, not in 1540, but 1640 or 1740? Well, it was difficult. One of the reasons why the church shrank so quickly was that after the English Civil War, and particularly after the so-called Glorious Revolution in 1688, if you were a Catholic of means, you couldn't go to university, you couldn't serve in the armed forces, you couldn't serve in Parliament, you couldn't do anything that people of your sort were bred to do. So what did you do? A lot of them went overseas. All over France and Spain and Portugal and Italy, you had colleges for the teaching of young English, Scots, and Irishmen. And you had this very odd paradox with the English Catholics of that period. They were, on the one hand, the most English of the English, almost like American Indians in a way. But they were also much more cosmopolitan than most Englishmen, because they had to be, they didn't have a choice. Now these gentry families and noble families that kept the faith going here and there, their tenants tended to keep the old religion as well. Eventually, in 1829, when the last of the penal laws were lifted and became legal to build Catholic churches in England again, where these noble families that had the local parish in their home chapel, they very often contributed to building a new church. And usually they'd keep the front pew. So that kind of old English Catholicism became very, very provincial in its way. And there's a true story, it's not a joke really, but some years ago, an American lady went to one of these parish churches built by the local Catholic family, the Bedingfields, and she sat down in the front pew. A little bit later, this beautifully dressed old lady in furs and diamonds came up, and she said, "Oh, pardon me, are you Lady Bedingfield?" And the woman said, "Well, no, I'm not." And she says, "Yes, well, I am she, and this is her pew." True story. But English Catholicism became very inward-looking. And like Irish Catholicism, it didn't produce a great deal in the way of literature and that sort of thing because it was busy trying to stay alive. Those were the recusants. And just so you'll know, that ethos was transported to this country. And if you go to southern Maryland, or what's called the Holy Land of Kentucky, you'll find a couple of islands of just that kind of Catholicism even today. John Carroll, the first Archbishop of Baltimore, came out of that background. All right. That was Roman Catholicism up until the mid-19th century. The Anglicans, they were in a very different spot. You have to go back to the Reformation itself. In some ways, the break with Rome changed the governance of the Church of England, but it didn't change the doctrine immediately. What did happen is that the Puritans, remember we were talking about the fun Calvinist people? They're back now for this part of the story. The Calvinist Puritans became the biggest, they stayed in the Church of England, they wanted to purify it of Roman influences. And they became very big among the middle classes, the upper middle classes, the wealthy and so forth. Not so much the nobility, it was some of them. Eventually, they came into conflict with the king, partly political, partly religious. The king was Charles I in the 1630s now. Now, the non-Puritan Anglicans was sort of there. And until the early 1600s under Elizabeth, who wanted to accommodate everyone. She wanted there to be a place for Puritans, for Catholicizing types, and for anybody and everybody. You can all be good Anglicans as long as they're loyal to the crown. That's all I ask. And the whole via media piece, the whole midway between the Protestants and the Catholics, this began to be thought up back then. Elizabeth dies. She doesn't have any children, of course. And her cousin, James I, son of the murdered Mary Queen of Scots. Anybody ever hear of her? Mary Queen of Scots? Look her up. Anyway, James I was her son. And he gave you the King James Bible, of which an old lady said to me once very proudly that if the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus Christ, it was good enough for her. Never quite forgotten that. For some reason, ladies and gentlemen, it's always the absurd and the bizarre that stays in my head. Everything else gets fuzzy, but I'll never forget that lady in my life. Anyway, what should happen but that James is able to keep the Puritans at bay. He's able to keep things together by not trying to change too much. But his son Charles is very different. James was married to a Catholic, Anne of Denmark. Their son, Charles I, was also married to a Catholic, a French lady, Henriette Marie, a French princess. She was so devoted to her faith that she would actually, and you've got to remember, it's illegal on the books to be Catholic. It is punishable by death on the books to be a Catholic priest. This is the kingdom that Charles inherited. In the midst of that, the Queen is leading processions to Tyburn Hill to venerate the martyrs who were murdered there under Elizabeth. It boggles the mind. Charles I, when he inherits the kingdom, he inherits 7 or 8 priests around the country in prison for practicing their trade. Well, what's he going to do? He can't release them because already people are saying he's too pro-Catholic. But he's certainly not going to execute them. So there they sit. But he allows them out during the day to perform their ministries. Think about that. They're in jail on a capital crime, but they can go out every day. This was interesting. He has an archbishop, Archbishop Laud, who is a Catholicism. He wants to try to re-Catholicize the church in England. And what does he do? Well, he brings back altar rails and things like that. Stuff that would really get you in trouble in this archdiocese in days gone by. Oh, that wasn't called for. But seriously, he did all this. He tried to bring back an idea of the real presence. He was actually offered the red hat by Rome, which he laughingly turned down. The Puritans were getting more and more upset. These two sides were on a collision course, and the result was that English Civil War, which I told you about. Not only was the king unable to keep these Catholic priests that he had formerly been able to go out from being murdered, as they were all executed, but so was Archbishop Laud. He couldn't, the country broke down into civil war. Now, why is this important? Because the Catholics were very much involved in that civil war as well, on the king's side. And his defeat meant the end of any, for the most part, of a return of England to Catholic unity. Now, mind you, the king's son, Charles II, when he came back after Cromwell, he converts on his deathbed. His brother has already converted, becomes king as a Catholic, and is overthrown as a result. What has been happening to Anglicanism in all of this? Well, the answer is that on a very local level, not a lot. They still do go through all sorts of calendar customs and this kind of thing. They're very, how do I put it? Christmas is Christmas, and Easter is Easter, which was not the case in Scotland or the Netherlands or any other Puritan country like that, any Calvinist country. But theologically, very few people, if any, believe in the real presence. It's very, very Protestant, very dry. So it was for the 18th century. Now comes something important, both for the authors of whom we're speaking and for the English Catholic heritage. What was that something? Who here has heard of Romanticism? No, some. What it was a reaction against the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, things like that. The Age of Reason, so-called. The Age of Reason that ended with guillotines. It went off into several different directions, but one of the things that inspired in England was a re-examination of the medieval Catholic past. And that's really important because the authors whom our three really liked were products of that period. The rediscovery of England's Catholic past. For Roman Catholics, as we call ourselves, as they call us, it led to a real, how do I put it, an attempt to reemerge from the shadows. And the fact that in 1829 we became completely legal again, and we started making converts from the Anglicans. Oh, it was great stuff. The biggest thing, though, that led the church in England to grow, to be honest with you, wasn't conversions, although we got some of the great converts. And it wasn't the old Catholics, because they weren't interested in conversions. It was Irish. Lots and lots of Irish. Made a big difference here in the States, too. All right. So what then happened with the Anglicans in that period was something called the Oxford Movement. And the Oxford Movement was spearheaded by Cardinal Newman, as he became later after he converted, and some other people. The important thing to bear in mind about it was that it rediscovered the sacraments. It rediscovered Catholic things like praying for the dead, which had been just simply not done. Why is this important for our three authors? Well, you're going to find out. Trust me. The idea of venerating Our Lady, all this kind of thing, underwent a resurgence both among Anglicans and amongst Catholics in England at the same period. It also was a huge catalyst in English literature, because also as a what's the word I'm looking for? I'm having a senior moment. As a riposte. You see the French comes, but I can't think of the English. A riposte to the Age of Reason was the start of fantasy literature. people like George MacDonald, who are very, very important. Now, we're coming to the moment. I'm almost ready to go into a 15-minute break, but before we do, there's a point that I will make. In our next period, we're going to talk specifically about the effect that the English style of Catholicism, both Catholic, Roman, and Anglican, had on our three authors, but scholarship about them today is not primarily Catholic or Anglican. Guess where the biggest center of studies of our three authors is, academic studies in this country? Wheaton College. And they have the biggest collection, not only of Lewis, Williams, and Tolkien, and Dorothy Sayers, G.K. Chesterton, George MacDonald, and somebody whose name just escaped me. That's Senior Moments. I don't recommend them. For you young people whose memories are really spot on, if you think, oh wow, those Senior Moments must be fun. No, don't you believe it. At any rate, the second, our second portion will look at the direct effect that everything I've just told you had on them. But it's important to remember that the view we get of our three authors is very often skewed today, precisely because it is conducted by people who do not understand their religiosity. And if that seems unimportant to you, well, let's just put it this way, ladies and gentlemen. We, all of us, wherever we come from, whatever we do, we see things through a particular prism that we see them through. With them, two of them being Anglican, one being Catholic from almost birth, you must understand those faiths to understand their work. With me, having grown up in Hollywood in the 60s, you'd have to understand UFO cults and that kind of stuff. But seriously, it is a major drawback to the study of these three gentlemen that specifically Catholics are not more engaged upon.